which is too bad. Todd's one of my good friends, and a very interesting fellow. So what I thought I'd do is tell you about my experiences at Atari and how I got there and so on. I'm a college dropout. Unlike most of the 2600 guys, I'm not an electrical engineer. Of course, in those days, computer science wasn't a big major. So when I dropped out of college, I decided I was going to sail around the world. So I built sailboats for 5 years. And later moved to New Mexico and decided I was going to build myself a geodesic dome. And about that time, I discovered a programmable calculator. And it was the beginning of the rest of my life, I think. So the first thing I did was generate a road racing game using an LED display. Of course, we didn't have LCDs then, so it was all LED. And had a little card reader HP that my brother owned. I actually didn't have enough money to buy my own, so I coded on his machine. And later, I went to work for a lumber yard, and they said, we need a computer. So I built them a computer, an old Processor Technology Sol, which was an 8080-based S100 machine, for those of you who are as old as I am. And built a game and sold it to a magazine that was popular then, called Creative Computing. And about that time, my wife turned to me and said, "Get me the hell out of New Mexico." So we went back to the Bay Area where she was from and where I had been raised. And I went into Atari, and I actually had 2 interviews. I interviewed with a Swiss power company who did power grid kind of software in Atari, and they both made me exactly the same offer. So I said, well, there is no choice here. I went to work for Atari and worked for Dennis Coble, who he and I later formed Imagic, which I'll get to. And I was 30 at the time and had 2 kids. So everybody else, Todd Fry and Howard Warshaw and Rob Zadibble and some of the other people were just getting out of college, and they were like 22 or 23. So I had a few years on them. And just before I arrived, the Fantastic Four had left. And of course, Dave Crane and Al Miller and Bob Whitehead and Larry Kaplan split from Atari to do Activision. So I filled one of the recs that was open for their positions. So Dennis showed me the list of games and said, listen, here's what we want. And the top of the list was video pinball. And I said, okay, I'll do a video pinball game for you. And my first assignment was to go over to corporate headquarters where the game room was and play hours and hours and hours of Superman Pinball, which was the only pinball machine that they had in the game room. And there was actually a Superman. I didn't play it, but it sure brings back memories. And I remember sitting in corporate, and of course, the very plush carpeting and so on. This is not where the engineers hung out. This is where all the execs were. So it was very nice and a very quiet room, and I played pinball for days and days and days. And I said, what a job. This is truly amazing. And I don't think I've had a real job since, actually. So I finished up video pinball for Atari in about 6 months. That was our typical program cycle. And went to CES. There was no E3 at that point, so we were showing at the Consumer Electronics Show. And they had a winter show in Las Vegas, and the summer show was in Chicago. So I managed to get video pinball done for the winter show, and went to Las Vegas. And of course, Atari was rolling in bucks at that point, so we were a really nice booth and a really nice display. And I held my breath as I watched the 4 Activision guys walk up to my game and play it. And they looked at it, and they looked at it, and of course, what we did in those days was try to figure out how it was done, because the 2600 was not a bitmap machine. I'll get to some of the ins and outs of the 2600 in a bit. They looked at it and they said, well, I think he can do the job. So I felt like I had finally joined the club at Atari, and I could actually program the 2600. Following that, I was 30 and had gray hair and 2 kids, so Dennis said, well, you need to be a supervisor. I want you to stop coding and start supervising. So I became a supervisor after about 8 months at Atari, even though I was self-educated in programming. And of course, all of us dream in 6502. We all knew exactly the length of every opcode and for the most part, what the hex was for opcode. The only interesting thing was a no-op was EA. So at that point, Todd was doing his translation of Pac-Man. So Todd was working for me, and Howard Warshaw was working for me when he did Yar's Revenge. And there were a few other games that were going on. I had half a dozen programmers under me. I was working with Brad Stewart, who later did the Asteroids conversion for the 2600. So at about that time, probably after about a year, Dennis started making noises about, well, gee, Atari really should be paying us royalties. And so we got together with Bill Grubb, who was a sales VP at Atari, and said, you know, I think we want to form a company. And he had been in touch with 4 or 5 Mattel people, and we decided that, or his business plan was to do 2600 cartridges and do Mattel as well. And Mattel was a strange GI 10-bit processor, 10 bits, yes. So they, and it was much more complex than the 2600, and they needed to get together a development system and everything else. Fortunately, when, well, let's see, we got lots of time here. So for about 6 months, Dennis was running the 2600 group at that point, and Dennis Coble did Atlantis and Trick Shot and several other titles for Imagic. But at Atari, he had been doing coin op and did some handhelds. And he transferred out. He thought, well, I really shouldn't be a manager of 2600 since I'm going to be leaving in 6 or 8 months. So we plotted along with Rob Fulop, who had done Missile Command and several other titles for Atari. And I'll tell you more about his Imagic work in a minute. And went to see a lawyer, incorporated, and found venture capital. Bill Grubb actually did an excellent job of finding us some venture capital. But we had to hang on at Atari for a while. So I remember a man by the name of Steve Wright was promoted to Dennis's job, and he called me in one day and closed the door and he said, I've heard rumors that there's a new company starting, just like Activision. And of course I turned beet red and started sweating. He never did catch on. I said, well, gee, Steve, I just don't know. So after I had been at Atari about 18 months, we finally decided to make the break and do Imagic. And we were instructed, they'll do anything to keep you. And of course, I was invited to go see Uncle Ray, who was Ray Kassar. He was an ex-president of Burlington Mills. So he really didn't know games, didn't know the industry. Nobody had a lot of respect for him because he was, basically a businessman. And he could have been running a toilet paper company for all he cared. And we were owned by Warner at that point. So on the day we left, we handed in our resignations, and they said, well, we want you to go see Ray, or Mr. Kassar is how it was phrased. And his pet lawyer, Skip Paul, who we called Skippy. We didn't have a lot of respect for him either. So we kind of passed on that and just walked out the door. And of course, we spent our first few weeks in court because Atari was not happy, extremely unhappy, in fact. We had the basic chip set for the 2600 was something called the TIA, which was completely proprietary to Atari. And that was the basis for the lawsuit, is we were stealing trade secrets from Atari, which we kind of thought of as mopery and dopery. But we had hired a hardware engineer who actually peeled the chip, decoded all the circuits, and drew them all out, and gave us a reverse engineering that we were able to legally use to start Imagic and do 2600 work. So the judge took one look at the case and threw it out after about 15 minutes. I mean, it was really a no-brainer for the judge. So we were safe in Imagic, and of course we had brand new in-circuit emulators, which was amazing, because at Atari we were using an old PDP machine and using line editors, which meant we had no screen display of our code. Essentially, we would say, print out a line, and it would print the line that the cursor was currently on, And then we'd give it a command to say, move forward 4 characters and insert 3, and then type in our code. So it was a very crude system, and we were only doing 4K cards, but it still took 10 or 15 minutes to assemble them. And actually, a lot of the guys got really good at asteroids and missile command, because during the assemblies, of course, coin op was just downstairs, so we would walk downstairs to coin op and play missile command and asteroids. And later on, we had a defender. And Todd was one of the best defender players I have ever seen. He was also very good at asteroids. So we had our brand new in-circuit emulators where we had a full screen editor. We could halt at any time, and for those of you who know anything about 2600 programming, as soon as the processor halts, you get vertical streaks on the screen. And the reason for that was that we actually coded the electron beam as it crossed the screen on every scan line. And that's why 2600 was something of an art, because we had to cycle count. We had 76 machine cycles per line. Most of the instructions were 3 cycles, immediates were 2, branches were 2 or 3, depending on whether it was taken or not taken. And this was all 6502, which is one of the most elegant little processors. It was only 8-bit. It had no math, no multiply, of course. It did have an add and subtract, but it was fairly crude, but it was very, very elegant, just because it was well thought out. They had a concept called zero page, which meant that the first 256 bytes of RAM were accessible in 1 cycle less. And of course, when we were timing our screens, as I said, we had 76 cycles per scan line. That extra cycle was a big difference. Later on, Todd started running his kernels. We called our screen code kernels, because it was the heart of the game. We usually spent our cycle was about 6 months. We would spend probably 2 months just doing the kernels, the actual screen display. And we had 22 cycles of horizontal blank on every line. So we had 22 cycles to get everything set up, and then we would change graphics as the beam moved across the screen. And the 2600 had 2 sprites. And that's why you'll see vertical separation in most of the games from the high resolution images. Because what we would do is, and we actually didn't have this nice thing, like an X and Y position that we got to write to. Essentially, you would delay the processor until a certain time of the beam across the screen, and then strobe a certain location, and that's where the sprite would be positioned. So we actually had repositioning. Parts of the kernel were just for repositioning sprites. We called them players at that time. And so what we would do is reuse these same players over and over again as the screen went down. So when you look at 2600 games, you'll see lots of vertical separation. And the reason for that is we were very limited in our high resolution objects. We also had what we called missiles, and 1 ball and 2 missiles. And of course, there was not, everything was monocolor, which meant we had color registers, so we could tell each sprite what color to be. But of course, its associated missile was also the same color. If you look at Rob Phillips' missile command on the 2600, he used missiles for all the incoming missiles, and had to reuse them. And that was kind of the foundation for flickering, because you only had 2 missiles and 2 players. So if you wanted 2 players or 4 players side by side that were independent in motion, you essentially needed to present one on one frame, and then the next one on the next frame. And we were always on a 60 hertz frame. So if it didn't flicker, we were at 60 hertz. And then I think Pac-Man was used 15 hertz, because he had the Ghost to do as well as Pac-Man. And the other piece of graphic we had was called Playfield, and unfortunately it had a 4-pixel resolution horizontally. So it was not very useful, but that's what Todd used for the Pac-Man dots as he ate the dots, was Playfield. And since the Playfield could be written on every scan line, the vertical resolution was 1 scan line, but the horizontal resolution was 4 pixels. So let's see some interesting stories from Atari. When Todd was doing his Pac-Man, Todd has been roundly criticized for his adaptation of Pac-Man, mainly because of the flicker. I was his supervisor when he was coding that, and he came to me one day and he said, "Listen, Bob, I can either do this so there's very little flicker, but it's not going to play well, or I can do almost a perfect adaptation of Pac-Man, but I'm going to have to go to 15 hertz. I'm going to have to flicker these guys like mad." And I admit, I told him, go for the gameplay. I said, graphics are nice, but it would be really nice if it played well. And that was always our foremost idea, was to make the game play. We didn't, we did care about the graphics, but gameplay always came first. And even now, and I'm still doing games, we always looked for a play mechanic before we looked at the graphics. And these days, it's kind of the other way around, but graphics will knock your socks off anymore. But gameplay was always the most important part of the game, and a game never shipped without gameplay. We couldn't do it. And the way we worked at the time at Atari, our PDPs were kind of few in number, so we only had one development system for every 2 or 3 programmers. So we all had hard offices. We didn't have cubicles, which was wonderful, but we would do our coding in our cubicles, and then we would go into a lab, and if there was an unoccupied development system, we would do our editing and debugging there. And of course, debugging was horrible. It was a simple processor, but the fact that when you halt the 2600, all you see are vertical streaks because the processor is not there to change the graphics. So you see whatever was on when you halted it would just streak right down the screen. I'm sure those of you who have played 2600 games have seen the streaks when you power down or put the cartridge in not quite all the way, or some other crash is a vertical streak, and that just means that the processor was halted. So we would go into the lab, and of course, since we always left our game running, even when it was really half done, we got a lot of feedback. So we always had critics to keep our gameplay up, and nobody would hesitate to say, this thing just plain doesn't play. You need to do this and this and this, or this and this and this. And there are actually a few instances of other programmers sneaking onto the development system and coding surreptitiously into somebody else's code base. I know, we all knew the coin-op guys because they were just downstairs from us. So if you look at Battlezone, you'll see that there's an erupting volcano in the background. And that was because one of the other programmers had insisted and then snuck some code in to make this volcano erupt. And it turned out it's a great feature. It's one of the, I think it's one of the cooler things in the game. And Steve Wright, who had been working on Pele Soccer, had an overhead view of the soccer players. He thought, well, this is the way I want to do it. And of course, we were doing our own graphics at that point. I actually have quadrille ruled notebooks that have all of my graphics, and my sons actually did a number of graphics for me. They were of the age where that was really fun for them. But someone snuck into Steve Wright's code and put little men running around instead of this overhead view. Steve thought, well, as long as you can see the foot kick, everything's fine. So he just had a little circle with one foot or the other that could go out front. So somebody snuck in and put real live men. This was Mike Lorenzen, who was a vastly underestimated 2600 programmer. Nobody ever gave him credit for his skill, but he was very, very good. And of course, Steve Wright came in the next morning and powered up his game and looked at it and exploded. He was the only one who never took it with a sense of humor. He was quite upset and demanded that this extra graphic be ripped out immediately. We weren't sorry to see Steve go. So at any rate, so Rob Fulop and Dennis Coble and I from the Atari group, and there were four people from the Mattel group, split to do Imagic. And that was another surreal experience. Here's a brand new company, here's an empty building, here's a brand new in-circuit emulator. And of course we had 1611As. 1611As were HP logic analyzers that were able to capture the last 256 operations on the processor. So we could see exactly what had executed and what had happened on the data bus and what had happened on the address bus. It was a wonderful tool. I almost bought one at the Imagic auction, but I thought, you know, the 6502 is going to be passé pretty soon, and I just don't have a use for it, but we love that tool. And of course, when we did our versions, we had to be exactly in sync with the television signal, which means it was, 16.687 microseconds per frame. And it also did timing. And of course, we had to generate vertical blank, and we didn't have to generate horizontal blank. That was actually in hardware. But we were generating the vertical blank signal. We turn on vertical blank and do 30 scan lines, then 192 of visible screen, and 40 lines of overscan. But the 1611A was able to time this. And of course, we were doing European versions at the time, which is a PAL, which is phase alternating line, for those of you who don't know. NTSC, we always called never twice the same color, because there were always color issues on NTSC. But PAL was quite good. But unfortunately, PAL had different timing. They were running a 50 hertz frame instead of 60 hertz. So after we had shipped the US version, we usually spent a month or so adapting it for PAL. And we had to change all the colors because the color was generated slightly differently. So the colors were different on the PAL versions, and the screen timing was different. Fortunately, we still had 76 cycles a line, so our kernels didn't have to change, but we did have to change our vertical timing. And then there was the awful CCAM, which was actually France and Russia at that point. I don't know what standard they're on now. But it was truly horrible. There were only 8 colors available to us. It was horrible. They were the ugliest versions we turned out, but of course marketing always wanted a CCAM version, so we would do a CCAM version as well. So anyway, we arrived at Imagic and had really sophisticated equipment compared with what we were using at Atari. And I did, Star Voyager was my first one, and it was kind of a disappointment. I used double line resolution because I was trying to get a star field, which meant that I needed more time to reset my players and missiles. So I decided, well, instead of single line resolution, I'll use double line. And of course, I got to CES I guess that was the winter show, and Al Miller of Activision showed a single line resolution, really, really nice game that was very, very similar to Star Voyager. So that was kind of a disappointment. But Al, later I worked for Al at Accolade, and I like Al a lot. So then I decided that I was going to do a cult classic. So I did Riddle of the Sphinx, because I thought, okay, Egypt, this is cool, and it did some nice vertical scrolling kernels, which was interesting because later on Carol Shaw used very, very similar kernels to do River Raid. And of course, River Raid sold 10, 100 times the amount that Riddle did. But, you know, and Carol, of course, was very, very good. She was, you know, just a genius. But of course, most of the people that I met at Atari are the smartest people I've ever met. But she was responsible for what we call the 6-care, which was the ability to show 6 characters on a line. And that's where you see a lot of your scores, your high resolution scores, and the little Activision logo that was at the bottom of the every screen was a 6 character. And of course, if you think about it, we only had 2 players, so being able to do 6 players on the same scan line involved timing that was, you know, obviously to the cycle. And it was a brilliant piece of work, and you know, she's one of the best, absolutely one of the best. So anyway, I did Riddle, and then I did Dragonfire. I always liked the idea of dragons, of course, and I had thought about the game of jacks. And for those of you who are more video oriented and not quite so much, the idea is you throw a number of jacks out on the floor and then bounce a ball, and you have until the ball bounces, and you have to catch it again, and then you have to gather up all the jacks. And I thought, you know, this would be a good game just because of the intuitiveness of it. I wanted to see something that where you weren't looking at single objects or shooting single objects. You were looking at the whole screen and trying to get a pattern. And I had admired Missile Command for a long time. I loved watching a good Missile Command player lay down a pattern of fire that basically the missiles would fly into. And the grace and the elegance of the action always appealed to me. So I thought, okay, what I'll do is I'll spread treasures, and then I'll add a threat, which was the dragon at the bottom. And the idea was to kind of move around while looking at the entire screen and gather up all the jacks, all the little prizes there. And when I was about done, I added another screen to it where you jump over or duck under fireballs, just as a little additional gimme. And it played well, and people liked the feature. So that's what Dragonfire was all about. And about that time, we only had a 4K address space. We only had 12 bits of address lines, which meant that we could only address 4K of ROM. And Atari had come up with a bank switch where you could actually swap in another 4K of ROM. And you couldn't have any more address space. You never got a 13th bit. But you could swap out the original 4K bank and swap in a new 4K bank, and here you had another 4K of ROM. So about that time, we started doing 8K cartridges. And Moonsweeper was an 8K. And actually, but later when I did Star Wars for Parker Brothers, which is it's another story. We used the 8K. And finally, Doug Neubauer, who had done Star Raiders for the 800, came to Imagic with a 16K card, and he had a little piece of it. Doug was a hardware guy, so he had designed his own 16K bank switch. And unfortunately, this is when the 2600 was kind of on its way out, so we declined to publish it. But it was a very neat little project. It was just very well done and very, very well coded for the 2600, which was no mean feat in itself. So later, as things were winding down on the 2600, Parker Brothers came to us and said, listen, we've got the Star Wars license for another 5 months. Can you make us a translation of the Atari Star Wars game in 5 months? And I was chosen, and actually we did several versions of it, SKUs we call them. Did one on the 400, 800, and Brad Stewart had joined us by this time, and did the Star Wars on probably 4 machines, and we actually did get it done in 5 months. And it's one of those games where I wish I had had another month, because I still wasn't happy with the kernels. And of course on that one, because there are 3 totally different screens on that, I had to do 3 sets of kernels. One for the space battle, and one for the towers, and then one for the gates. And the gates was the last screen I did, and like I say, I wish I had had another month to play with those kernels, because I know I could have done it better with less flicker if I had had another month, but it just wasn't in the cards, because they said this is absolutely the drop dead date. There will be no slipping on this project, because it's our license expires, and if we don't have it in the can by then it's all over. So about that time, the 2600 died, of course, as you all know, and I was the only founder of Imagic who was actually at the auction where we sold off all of our assets. We had moved into the Activision building and later sold all of our Imagic games to Activision. So Activision owns all of the titles that Imagic did. How am I doing for time? Well, I'm going to open up the floor to questions, because that's always the most interesting part of any of the talks. Anybody have any questions? Sure.
Did you ever consider, maybe going back to the Star Wars game and just for fun, putting in that last month of work?
Yes and no. It's funny. I rarely played my games after they were done, mainly because I'd been sitting in front of this screen for 6 months. I had played it 10,000 times, and nobody is as good at the game as the guy who codes it. And at that point, I was kind of sick of it. And it would have been only for my own pleasure. And it was hard, to quote Steve Cartwright. I remember sitting at Accolade when we were working on a graphic adventure, and the marketing people were behind him. They had found a bug, and they came into Steve, and they were actually standing over his shoulders while he was trying to code. And finally, he turned around and he said, "Hey, this is hard." But on the other hand, I'm actually working on a 2600 title right now. There was a game that I had started I was doing a game on the 400, 800 just as the money ran out from Imagic. And I decided probably about a year ago that I was going to code it for the 2600. So I actually have it in an 8K form, and I finally decided to go to 16K because, hey, ROM is cheap, as they say. And I know what features I could gain with that extra 8K. Mainly sound. When we did sound on the 2600, we essentially had we had two channels, and we had a frequency register and a noise register, which basically said, give me a pure tone or give me white noise, and that was it. And of course, you had to program it real time. So at one point, I actually did table drive one of my sounds in Video Pinball, which meant that I had a table that said, okay, on this frame it's going to be this frequency, and on the next frame it'll be this frequency, etc. But most of the time we did algorithmic sounds, which meant that a lot of the sounds were generated with on the order of 4 to 6 bytes of code, as well as a couple of pieces of RAM. And the 2600 had only 128 bytes of RAM, so RAM was very, very precious. And algorithmic sounds involved, we always maintained a frame counter, that every time we had generated a frame, we would add one to the counter, and it was we actually made it a 16-bit counter, which was unusual too, because this was an 8-bit processor. And we would take the counter and say, well, let's see, take the low 4 bits of the counter and divide it by 2 and feed that to the frequency. So we would get very, very cheap sounds, and sounds were almost always the last thing that we coded. Brad Stewart actually did Talking Baseball, and he did it by table driving samples, much as it's done today, but it sucked up virtually all of his ROM. Anybody else? Yeah.
So you and some of the other speakers mentioned interviewing for Atari and then going on with your careers. I wonder if you can remember like some of the interview questions. I mean, how did you pass the test for
Well, there was the infamous Fred test, and I actually interviewed with CoinOp at the same time that I interviewed with Consumer, which was the 2600 group. They both made me offers, but I was frankly afraid to go to CoinOp because those guys were so good. In fact, the Ed Log, who we call the programming god, brilliant guy, did asteroids. Very, very, in fact, I'm working with him now at a new company, but I was afraid to go to CoinOp. But the Fred test was 2 ands and an exclusive OR. And the basic idea was you wanted to combine 2 bytes. You wanted the low 3 bits of 1 byte and the high 4 bits of the other, or the high 5 bits of the other byte. How do you combine these two? And there's a very elegant operation that takes 6 bytes of code and 6 cycles, because they were all immediates. And so they showed us, and they called it the Fred test. I'm still not sure why, but I got that test at in CoinOp, and yeah, I figured it out. But that was the extent of the technical things. I had generated a game on the 8080 using this processor technology machine. It was actually a point of view slalom race. And so I actually had a game to show at Atari before I came there. I think that that's part of the reason that Dennis hired me, apart from my gray hair. But yes, there were technical interviews. They're probably nothing compared with what goes on today. And of course, I kind of made my bones in 2600, so I've never really had to do overly technical test before. When I went to 3DO, we talked about 3D graphics, and I had done some, but I got my start in 2D. So I can hold my own in 3D, but I certainly don't consider myself a master of the art. Yeah.
When you were back at Atari, say doing pinball, can you explain what the process was like in terms of coming up with a game design? Did you have to draft something up and present it, or did you just start coding and say, here it is?
The 2600 group was very laid back. And remember, most of the group were like 22, 23-year-olds just out of college. Of course, they all loved games. I remember Bob Pilaro used to always take Wednesdays off to go play volleyball in Santa Cruz. That was his thing. And most of the other guys would show up at about 11 a.m. and work later. And of course, I had a family, so I was always there at 9 a.m. That's one of the reasons they made me a supervisor, was I actually had regular work hours. But we did have design reviews. But essentially, we were given the idea, or we said, okay, I want to do this. I remember, Rob Phillips says, I think I can do missile command. And it was always hard to be able to generate the display on the 2600. So, we always thought long and hard. In fact, when I did video pinball, I probably worked out in graph paper for weeks, drawing the screen and trying to figure out what I could actually present. The flippers at the bottom were a major task, and I used everything. I used the ball, and I used the missiles, and I used playfield. The bumpers are all playfield because I had no more high resolution objects, and of course the numbers that were within the bumpers had to be players, had to be sprites. And of course they were all vertically separated, and then by the time you got to the flippers, I had to reset the positions of everything so that the flippers could be shown. So there was always the vertical separation, and then probably the biggest part of it was the lab situation, because everybody got to look at your game. So you were always getting either kudos or flack about your game. Oh, this doesn't play. You need to do this, or you need to do that. And oh, I saw a screen jump. And I remember when I was doing collision detect on video pinball, I had table driven a lot of it for speed. As Todd used to say, tables for time, ROM for RAM. You could usually use tables and make it execute faster, and you could usually, and RAM executed faster than ROM. A ROM was a 4-cycle access, whereas the 0 page was 3 cycles. Some of them were 5 and 6, but that's where you used a lot of indirection. So the lab was really the acid test, and that because everybody got to see your game. And of course, marketing people would cruise through every 6 months or so, and we all hated that. Because I remember my first marketing review was video pinball, and we were just about ready to go to CES, and it was looking pretty good. And one of the marketing people looked at it and said, "Can't you get a round ball?" And of course, the ball object was basically on or off. It was, 1 bit. So there was really, a snowball's chance in hell of getting a round ball, unless I used a sprite, which I was completely unwilling to do because there were, so many other objects that really wanted that high resolution to work. And then once in a while, we would have a design review after it was done. I remember Chris Crawford had made a Wizard game, and that was one of the first design reviews I sat in on. And Rick Maurer, who did Space Invaders, who was another vastly underestimated 2600 person. Space Invaders is a masterwork. The timing, thinking about all of the descending monsters on that, an amazing piece of coding. And I don't think he slept for the 6 months that he did that project. But we did have design reviews, and Rick Maurer had generated a maze game. And I think he had on the order of 128 or 256 variations on the game, invisible maze and, this maze and that maze, and then you can combine these two features and had an amazing amount. And unfortunately, the game never went out. People and Chris Crawford's 2600 title never went out either, even though it was interesting. And Rick's maze game, was all generated in playfield at 4 pixel resolution, but it was just very well done. But I can't say enough good things about his Space Invaders, because I remember going to company meetings when I first arrived at Atari, and they said, "Well, Space Invaders has sold 50,000 units. And everybody went, oh, really? And every week afterward, it would be Space Invaders has sold 200,000. And then it got up to 1 million, and we were just flabbergasted, just flabbergasted. And of course, you know, Space Invaders kind of took the country by storm. So, but you know, it was worthy of it because it was extremely well coded and it played well, and it was a great title. But you know, as I watched that one take off, that was the first one that really hit the moon. Anybody else? Sure.
You mentioned that gameplay was a top priority, no matter what, and you also mentioned that these days it seems like that. Do you have any commentary on the state of gameplay in games today?
I do. You know, some games are pretty. You know, you look at something like Angry Birds, and the gameplay is certainly there. You know, the graphics are interesting. You know, they're not horribly exciting, but they're interesting. But it's gameplay, and anymore, I'm actually working on iPad titles with a small company named Innovative Leisure. And my philosophy has always been find the right game mechanic and then build a game around it. When you find something, you know, an activity that's actually fun to do and feels good and gives you a sense of accomplishment and a sense of challenge and, you know, all the things that you look for in a good game mechanic. So I'm strictly a game mechanic guy because I know that the graphics will fall. And of course, these days we have graphic artists. You know, in the old days, we did our own graphics on graph paper. And as I said, I have notebooks full of my graphics and my kids' graphics. Another interesting story is I probably hired the first pixel artist in the business, and that was Marilyn Toyer. Just before I left Atari, I finally went to the head of the department and said, you know, this is really dumb, us doing our own graphics. Really dumb. It's a waste of our time, and you know that someone with an eye can do so much better than we can. So we hired Marilyn, and nobody has looked back since. And it was obviously the right thing to do. And of course, now we have sound people. Usually I found a lot of programmers are into music and sound. And I would always find another programmer who liked to do music and liked doing sound. So when I wanted, you know, a tune or whatever and a little bit of music code, I would just find another programmer and say, listen, you know, I'll give you 10% of my royalties if you want to do the tunes for me. Anybody else? Am I missing anybody? I got kind of some bright lights. Yeah.
Did you actually receive royalties that you know lately? It's pretty rare.
Yes, it is. When we were at Atari, I was paid $16,000 a year when I first started at Atari, and of course, after I had done video pinball, I believe I got a $4,000 bonus that year. But it was against Atari policy, and that's the reason that the Fantastic Four left to form Activision. Is they walked into Ray one day and said, you know, we want a nickel a card. And Ray said, absolutely not. And they said, bye-bye. And when we formed Imagic, we actually had a little bit of a brouhaha during our incorporation because Rob and I were both accomplished 2600 people. Dennis had not done 2600 yet, but he was an accomplished programmer. So we want 2 cents. I believe, or it was 2%. I think it was about a quarter a cartridge, something like that, for Imagic products. And of course, the execs really didn't want to give it to us. But we said, you know, this is the reason we wanted to Imagic is A, we feel like we deserve some credit. You know, there wasn't any kind of screen space to put our names on the game, but at least they could be in the booklet. Whereas at Atari, they wanted everybody to be anonymous. And so I did get royalties with Imagic. And that was probably the last. Actually, no. When I worked for Al Miller at Accolade after the 2600 bus, doing Sega and Super Famicom code, and Accolade paid royalties as well. But that was because Al Miller was an ex-Activision guy and understood the importance of it. But by that time, you know, we had graphic artists, and we were the only ones who officially got royalties, but all of us split with our sound and art people because they were obviously so important to the project. And we usually kick something to the support people, you know, people who kept our hardware running and things, because you can't do the job without them. Okay, I think we're about done. Thank you very much.